Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Jew Like Me. My name is Jessica Israel, and this is a podcast for all of us who love Torah, but have felt like we are not fully represented in mainstream Jewish life or the pop culture idea of who a Jew is or what a Jew looks like. We are the children of Abraham, and this podcast is to create our place at the table, let our voices be heard, and celebrate the multiculturalism of Judaism. Let's get into our episode. So today I am really excited to do this episode. This is the one that I've honestly wanted to do since I started the podcast. And I will say probably really inspired me to move forward with it, thinking about this topic. So we are going to talk today about who is a Jew? What is a Jew? What does it mean to convert? How do you convert? And we're going to talk about this within the scope of Torah. We're not going to use what man-made institutions have developed. Communities can decide whoever they want to accept, and how they want to accept them, and whatever processes they have, that's fine. But what we're going to talk about today is Torah. We're not going to talk about politically who someone says is a Jew, what the state of Israel says needs to be done for you to be considered a Jew, or what man-made institutions, different denominations and things that do not exist in Torah. None of that exists in Torah. We're not going to go by what they say who is a Jew. So again, like I said, communities can decide whatever requirements they have and who they want to invite in and how they want to accept someone. That is perfectly fine. But we're going to talk about what Torah says, because that's what matters. And hopefully this gives a lot of people some peace in their identity, because it's really something that I know that people who either practice outside the rabbinical landscape or mainstream Jewish landscape experience a lot. And even those within it. You could be a rabbinical Jew and practice under a major denomination, but maybe you're a Jew of color and you still feel like you're on the outside looking in sometimes. So we're going to talk about that. Just to make that clear, I know someone had asked me online why I was putting Jews of color together with non-Rabbinical Judaism. But that's definitely not what I'm doing on this podcast. And I think anybody who's listened to the first few episodes, I think you understand that as well. I'm speaking from a perspective of where we look at what Torah says. So we're not going to say, well, Talmud says this is what you're supposed to do. We're going to look directly at the Torah because that's my perspective. I do not practice rabbinical Judaism, and I know there's lots of people who don't. I guess I could be best identified as a karaite, but a lot of people, they don't have those labels. They may not like the label. If you look throughout the continent of Africa, there are people there, Jews, Israelites, actually, who have been practicing, a form of Judaism that is in exact alignment with the Torah, that goes back to the first temple. And they've been practicing that untouched for centuries, thousands of years. And, there's this degrading process that happens where they are either questioned about whether they're really Jews or told they need to convert into these man-made institutions that were established after the Second Temple. So I'm not putting together Jews of color and non-rabbinical Judaism, but we do have to understand that throughout the continent of Africa and other places, that there have been groups of Jews who have continued to practice First Temple Judaism as it is in the Torah. And a lot of these groups are people of color. And unfortunately, they can be rejected by the mainstream for two factors, for their skin color and for the way that they practice. So that's something that really needs to be brought to light and some attention paid to. And then also just the fact that, like I said, I'm talking to everyone who kind of feels like they're on the outside looking in. So maybe you're not a Jew of color, but you practice, karaite Judaism, you're karaite Israelite, or you're non-denominational. You feel like, hey, I'm just a Jew, or I don't like a label, but I only go with what Torah says and what Tanakh says. You're welcome. Or if you are a Jew of color and that's the way you practice, or you're a Jew of color and you practice rabbinical Judaism, that you do follow the Talmud, you do follow the Mishnah, these are the things that you accept as part of your halakha, and that's okay too. But maybe you still have that feeling of, hey, I'm on the outside looking in because I don't feel fully accepted as a Jew. Whether you were born into a family that practices Judaism and your family has a history of practicing it, or whether you were someone who converted. There's many different factors. And the purpose of my podcast is to speak to all of those people who have either felt rejected, felt like they were on the outside looking in, felt like they were not fully accepted into the fold, or have ever really been in these Jewish spaces and made to not feel completely comfortable. There are lots of things that we go through. If you look online, you'll think that sometimes you're going to get support from the tribe, but if you're a Jew of color, you may see racist remarks. This is real life. This is what happens. So I've created this podcast for that reason. I just wanted to get that out the door. In case this person listens to it, you understand, although I did explain this to them in a message. I want everyone to understand that, and I want them to be able to go back to this episode and see where I'm coming from so that nothing is misconstrued. And again, I'm approaching this from a Torah perspective, from a Tanakh perspective. So if you are a Jew who practices, let's say, a form of Orthodox Judaism or conservative Judaism, and you believe in the halakha of the Talmud only, and maybe what your denomination says only, I am not challenging that. I am simply pointing out what the Torah says. This is what I believe. This is what I go by. I don't go by man-made institutions. If somebody else does, that is perfectly fine. One thing we do not do here is we do not argue theology. We only say what the Torah says. As I've stated before, and what is worth truly noting also, is that this podcast is called A Jew Like Me. A Jew Like Me. It's called that for a reason, because this is just my opinion, my understanding. Maybe you share it, maybe you don't. Maybe this is a great point for you to tee off on a discussion in a perspective that maybe you didn't think about before. But I am not the Jew. I don't represent anyone on a larger scale. I'm not the voice for every karaite, which there is no such thing as a voice for every karaite. If someone tells you that or makes you believe that, that's wrong. Because literally the whole premise of being a karaite is to search scripture well for yourself. Everyone has the responsibility to read the Tanakh themselves and understand it and draw their conclusions. And I do not represent every Jew of color. Not at all, not in the least. So make sure that you understand that when you're listening to this, that this is just my perspective. And maybe you agree and maybe you don't. And, that's okay. Hopefully you'll take something away from it. And hopefully, if anything, you'll say, oh, wow, this is a perspective I never thought of before. I didn't know that people thought, or there were some people who thought this way and whatnot. So now let's get into what we're talking about. Who is a Jew? What does it mean? How do you convert? All of these different things. People are always asking this question. So there was a podcast episode that really inspired me that I remember listening to a few years ago. And I had actually posted it on my social media as well. It was an episode from Nehemiah Gordon. You can Google him and look at his website. He has it up there too. And it was titled How to Convert to Judaism, I believe. And he was talking about what it says biblically. Because he himself said he doesn't believe in man-made institutions. He respects what people do. He respects the communities. And, if somebody wants to create certain rules, regulations, checkpoints, processes for someone to join their community, that's fine. But if you're asking biblically, what does the Bible say about conversion? That's a bit of a different discussion. It's also not the same as a political discussion. It's not the same as saying, well, I want to make an aliyah to Israel. Well, that's a different thing. That's a political discourse. That's government. That's not the same as what the Tanakh says. So we want to make sure we're all having the same discussion. And I really enjoyed that, and it really inspired me, because I was like, yes, I know I'm not going crazy here, that this is what the Tanakh says. Because sometimes when other voices are drowning out, I guess you want to say maybe the minority. Heck, we may not even be the minority perspective, to be honest. But when you have the louder voices drowning things out, when certain things have been established in the terms of, well, this is how you do it, and this is what they say, and statements are made to be representative of a group as a whole, maybe you feel like, well, wait, I guess there's no place I fit in here. And he was pointing out, like I said, what the Tanakh says about conversion. I always found it odd, the conversion process that you see within denominations, because to me, when I read Torah, that's not what it says. So we're going to go and start this off, guys. We are going to study our word. We're going to read, and we're going to see, what does this actually say? Because it talks about it. So in Isaiah 56 verses 3 through 8, it says, "Let not the foreigner say, who has attached himself to the Lord." Okay, let's start off with that. We're going to break it up. We're going to get in the weeds with this one. It says, who has attached himself to the Lord. That right there is the key point to hang on to, guys. Literally, Isaiah is talking about the fact that you have to attach yourself to God. It's not a certificate that someone gives you. It's not anyone saying, oh, I approve you to be a Jew. Here you go. You're a Jew today. You have to attach yourself to God, okay? That is the first thing that you must do. That is what you have to do. That is what is required of you. It says, let not the foreigner say, who has attached himself to the Lord will keep me apart from his people. And let not the eunuch say, I am a withered tree, for thus says the Lord, as for eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire, and hold fast to my covenant, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters. I will give them an everlasting name, which shall not perish. As for the foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord, again, we're repeating this. And as many of you know, when something is repeated in the Bible, you listen. There's a reason why it's repeated. So verse 3, it says, who has attached himself to the Lord, talking about the foreigner. Again, in verse 6, who has attached themselves to the Lord, talking about the foreigner or ger or a non-Jew. As for the foreigner who attaches themselves to the Lord, to administer to him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who hold fast to my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus declares the Lord God, who gathers the dispersed of Israel. I will gather still more to those already gathered. And that's telling you right there. That's not only telling you that God is welcoming and wanting people to convert. He wants people to follow him, obviously. And we see later on where it literally says, one law for the natural born and one law for the sojourner. Basically we all have the same law. There is no different law for us. If you follow Yehovah, obviously that's the name that I use for God. That's the way that I believe we pronounce his name. You may disagree, and hopefully that doesn't offend anyone hearing me say that. But there's one law. The law that was given to Moses that we're following. It is one law for all of us if we decide to follow him. That is your conversion. Literally, when you were saying the Shema, when you were saying that Hero Yisrael, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Yehovah Eloheinu, Yehovah Echad. You have done it. If you believe that, if you say that, if that's in your heart, and then you go and say, I'm going to live the way that he's instructed me to, boom, that's it. You don't need a certificate. You don't need anybody else co-signing you. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. It doesn't matter whether someone accepts you or not, or says, well, you're not really a Jew. Well, your mom wasn't a Jew. Well, you didn't go through this formal conversion and, do a mikvah in front of the XYZ people or go in front of the Beit Din. No, that's not what it says. It's not what it says at all. And the interesting thing about it is that, like I said, it repeats twice. The foreigner who has attached himself to the Lord. It is something you have to do for yourself and only you. And I really loved that podcast episode that I was telling you about because Nehemiah goes into this. He expresses, he says the same thing. And he points that out where people have asked him, hey, can you convert me? And he's like, I can't do that. This is something you have to do for yourself. If you want a man-made institution, go seek out those man-made institutions if you feel like you need that piece of paper and that certificate, but that's not what I do. And I loved that part. I thought it was great because it's telling people, look to the word. Look at what God said. Look at what his prophets have told us. This is from him. He's telling you what you need to do. You don't need somebody else. Now, if you're not feeling comfortable because you feel like, well, you need everybody else to say that you're a Jew as well. Well, then you can go ahead and go through those institutions. But I would suggest reading this again, doing some soul searching. I created this episode because I want to give you that comfort and knowing that you don't need to do that. You really don't. And also, you need to understand that who one person says they accept as a Jew may not be universal. In fact, it actually usually isn't universal. Heck, if you go to Israel and you say, well, I'm a Jew, I went through a Reformed conversion, an Orthodox rabbi is not going to accept that. They're not going to accept that. They're going to say, well, you're still not a Jew. I'm sorry. That's nice you went through that process, but nope, that's not our formal conversion. So literally you have people who will go through one denomination and go through a full conversion process. And then the next denomination will say, hey, sorry, we don't accept that. So that's the interesting thing is that you may not be considered, quote unquote, a Jew, depending on who you're talking to. It doesn't even matter if you were born into a Jewish family, if your father was Jewish, because they may say, well, we only believe in matrilineal descent, which in my opinion is not biblical. You don't actually see that. And a lot of people, if you talk to a scholar or if you read any of the scholars, they know that that's not really in there. That's really not even a debate. But it's just what they've established. Obviously, because you know who the mother is when the baby comes from them. It's kind of a practicality standpoint, to be perfectly honest. But we'll even get a little bit more into that later on. But yeah, so when you're looking at this is really important. And something that I took from it is that not only does it say who has attached himself, is that the next line is saying, don't say to yourself, if you've attached yourself to me, which is a conversion. If you've converted, right? Don't say to yourself that you're going to be kept apart from his people, meaning that you're going to be kept apart from Israel, which means that you are one with Israel. You're attached to Israel as well. And that was Isaiah 56. And then if you actually go to Isaiah 14 a little bit, now mind you, this is the same prophet, right? So we're getting the same message. In Isaiah 14, second sentence of verse 1, and the stranger shall join them and shall cleave to the house of Jacob. So it's showing you about accepting and attaching yourself to God and his people. We are one people. That's really important to know and to understand. So when someone says, well, how do I convert? Well, I guess I follow this, but I'm not considered a Jew. Well, according to who? Because don't let somebody else define who you are. And that's another thing with the words and the language that we get into is understanding biblically, what are we called? Okay. Abraham was a Hebrew, right? Abraham had Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac had Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. That's where you get Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, the house of Jacob. Okay? So if Abraham was a Hebrew, right, that means that Ishmael and Isaac were Hebrews. That means that Jacob and his descendants are all Hebrews. But Jacob and his descendants are all Israelites, right? So you would have a Hebrew Israelite if you follow the line of Jacob, okay, via Abraham. If you follow the line of Ishmael via Abraham, you would be a Hebrew Ishmaelite. Interestingly enough, Ishmaelites are Muslims. So if you ever hear me refer to or say the term, oh, our Muslim cousins, this is why I say that. Because biblically, we are. And the reality is we have more in common than what separates us. We are all children of Abraham. We all believe in the same God, the God of Abraham. We believe in one God. In fact, when I was mentioning the Shema earlier, you actually have, in order to convert to Islam, you say the Shahada, which is the same exact thing, which is literally stating that God is one. He is our God and he is one. It's important to also understand that with Islam as well, that you have a sect that's very similar to Karaites. They're called Quranists, right? They only follow the words of the Quran. They don't follow anything that they consider to be extra biblical. So they don't follow hadiths and things like that, which I guess you could relate to the Islamic version of a Talmud, right? So for them, literally, their Shahada is basically exactly like the Shema. It doesn't even include anything about Muhammad, which the reality is, in case some people don't know, Muslims do not worship Muhammad. They would actually be very offended if you were to imply that or to say that or to even suggest that. They simply believe that he was a prophet. They believe he was a very important prophet, but they only worship one God. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you have that real knowledge, okay? And don't be confused because they use the term Allah, because Allah is just God in Arabic. If you're in an Arabic country, even if you're a Jew and you're speaking Arabic, you're going to use the name Allah. So that's not a different God. That's not a foreign God. That is our God. We all worship the same God, even if we may do things a little bit differently. We are all family here, okay? So that's something that's really important to understand, and why I make sure that I make it clear that Islamophobia, things like that, are definitely not welcome in my sphere, not welcome on this podcast, not welcome on any of the comments on social media. So when you're looking at that name, and so, okay, well, we're Hebrew Israelites. Well, this is also part of the problem in today's age where people have co-opted terms. Unfortunately, especially as a Jew of color in the United States, if you were to accurately describe yourself as a Hebrew Israelite, because you are, Father Abraham was a Hebrew, right? If you follow the line of Israel, then you are an Israelite, right? Because we follow the laws of Moses that was given to him, correct? So if you use that term, Hebrew Israelite, which is biblically correct, someone may associate you with a certain group, a fringe group, who actually believes in the New Testament, that you'll see sometimes on street corners yelling in colorful garb that they've created to replicate the priestly garb described in the Bible. And a lot of times their comments are bigoted, misogynistic, racist. It's not okay at all. And they'll think that you belong to them. But that's not the case. And that's why language and the terms we use and understanding who we are is so important. Because if someone says I'm a Hebrew Israelite, don't automatically assume that they belong to what they call these camps. Ask them about their beliefs. Ask them what they represent. Because the reality is that is actually the accurate term to describe who we are. Okay? Like as a Karaite Jew, really, I'm a Karaite Israelite. I am an Israelite. Karaite just describes not even the theology, to be honest, because it's going on Torah. It's just the philosophy, the way we approach it. The idea that, okay, we take the Tanakh only. For me, I take the Torah, as my law. I don't believe any new laws were introduced in the Tanakh after Torah. So I take the Torah as my basis for everything that I need to know. And then the full Tanakh, when we're talking about the writings and the prophets, I take those as, okay, this is additional information to describe and let me know what has happened. And to maybe fill in, I don't even say fill in any gaps, but, to just give me more information of what happened after. But otherwise, there's nothing new that I get from Tanakh, me personally. So, for example, any new holidays or anything like that, I don't celebrate or observe if it's not in the Torah. If it wasn't established by Moses, then it's not something that I follow, for me personally. And I understand that a lot of Karaites, they follow the same way. So, you won't find me celebrating Purim. It's just not something that I celebrate. I mean, do I think that it's the worst thing ever and that no one should ever do it? No. It's just not something that I believe is mandated, and I don't do it for my own reasons, And same thing with Hanukkah. I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating Hanukkah, but do I feel like it's commanded? Do I have to? No, I don't. So, now that we've kind of gotten that out the way, when we're talking about what the Tanakh says in terms of conversion, so let's talk about the story of Ruth. Ruth is considered the most famous convert. And it's interesting, too, because, we use convert as almost like a dirty word a lot of times. And it really shouldn't be. And I'll even get into that a little bit later, how my perspective, honestly, is at some point every Jew has to become a Jew by choice. But we'll get into that a little bit later in this episode. So Naomi had 2 daughter-in-laws, okay? So one was Ruth and the other was Orpah. And she told them, like, hey, my sons are dead and, you can leave, basically. They passed away. So not only did they pass away, and her husband also passed away. So it was just the 3 women. And she told them both, you guys can go back to your homeland and I'm going to go back to mine. Naomi was an Israelite. So her sons were Israelites as well. So that was, her homeland. That's where she came from. And Ruth was a Moabitess. She was not an Israelite. She was not a Jew. Now, even though they both said, no, we'll stay with you, Naomi said, no, it's okay. You go back to your home. You have no more obligation to me. The one daughter-in-law, Orpah, kissed her goodbye and went her separate ways. But Ruth stayed behind. Ruth literally begged and pleaded and said, no, like, I'm not going to leave. She literally said, and this is one of the most, famous lines, because Naomi was telling her, go follow your sister-in-law, go back home. You don't have to stay with me. And you don't have to come to where my home is. You don't have to come with my people. But this was Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 through 17. Literally says, but Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And if you look at what she said, your people will be my people, your God, my God. This is exactly what we were talking about in Isaiah, where that's what you needed to convert. Just that acceptance. Doesn't mean there's fancy schmancy words or anything like that. Literally acknowledging the God of Abraham is my God. This is who I will serve. This is who I will worship. This is who I will follow. And his people, Israel, I am attaching myself to. That is it. That is what you need. Ruth was not born into an Israelite family. She was a Moabitess when she was born. That's what she was born into. And as you see here, by her accepting God and accepting his people, she converted. She is the great-grandmother of King David. That is a big deal. She wasn't just any person here. She was literally King David's great-grandmother. Big, big deal, guys. So that's something that we really have to look at. So when you're talking about conversion processes, when you're talking about, well, how do I convert? And, well, who is considered a Jew and who's not considered a Jew? All you have to do is look in the Tanakh. It says it right there. It's also interesting because I'm going to bring something up that I'm sure you would not expect either. Is Rambam. Rambam, okay? I'm sure you know who he is, one of the most famous rabbis and scholars with regard to Judaism. And although he was a rabbinical Jew, I want to make a side note. Being a karaite or being a non-rabbinical Jew doesn't mean you don't read rabbinical text, and it doesn't mean that you can't agree with rabbis or you can't agree with anything that's in the Talmud. That just means that you don't believe that it's inherently binding. That's it. So, Rambam's letter to Obadiah the convert. Very interesting. So, in the letter, Obadiah was actually asking him, well, am I allowed to pray and say, my God, our people, you brought us out of the land of Egypt? I'm paraphrasing here. But these are the things he was asking him. And Rambam literally said, you may say all of this in the prescribed order and not change it in the least. In the same way as every Jew by birth says his blessing and prayer, you too shall bless and pray alike, whether you are alone or pray in the congregation. And the reason for this is that Abraham, our father, taught the people, opened their minds, and revealed to them the true faith in the unity of God. He rejected the idols and abolished their adoration. He brought many children under the wings of the divine presence. He gave them counsel and advice, and ordered his sons and the members of his household after him to keep the ways of the Lord forever, as it is written. For I have known him to the end, that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice. From Genesis 18:19. Ever since then, whoever adopts Judaism and confesses the unity of the divine name, as it is prescribed in the Torah, is counted among the disciples of Abraham, our father. Peace be with him. These men are Abraham's household, and he it is who converted them to righteousness. Interesting, right? That we have all these institutions that create all these processes. Now, I'm not saying the Rambam wasn't in favor of having additional processes or anything, but I'm saying that in his letter, he's expressing literally what the Tanakh says, and saying that whoever adopts Judaism and confesses the unity of the divine name, as it is prescribed in Torah, is counted among the disciples of Abraham. That is what you need. It's interesting because, like I said, we put up all these barriers, but it's so simple. It is so simple. And even he says that there's, one law for the natural born and one law for the convert. We talk about that. That's in Numbers 15:15, I believe. And then he goes further to say, know that our fathers, when they came out of Egypt, were mostly idolaters. They had mingled with the pagans in Egypt and imitated their way of life until the Holy One, may he be blessed, sent Moses, our teacher, the master of all prophets, who separated us from the nations and brought us under the wings of the divine presence, us and all proselytes, converts, and gave to all of us one law. And the funny thing is, actually in that letter, he quotes Isaiah 56:3. That says, neither let the son of the stranger that has joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord has utterly separated me from his people. Then he goes on to say, there's no difference whatever between you and us. It's there, guys. I mean, it's there from this letter that Rambam wrote. It's there in the Tanakh. It's there. And one of the things that I believe personally, and this is just me, and this may actually, I'm not sure if everyone will agree, but I believe that every Jew becomes a Jew by choice at some point. Because you can be born into a Jewish family, but at some point you have to decide whether you're going to follow Judaism or not. You have to decide whether you are going to follow the laws of Moses, if you're going to believe in Jehovah as the one God, the only God, and follow him. It's a choice you have to make. So that's why I don't even like saying being born Jewish or this person was born Jewish. You may be born into a Jewish family. And obviously, because that's what you're born into, that family, that dynamic, that education, this is what you're growing up practicing. So yes, you are a Jew. You are an Israelite. But at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to continue to be one or not. And that's why I believe that every Jew at some point becomes a Jew by choice. And someone may say, well, no, it doesn't matter, because if your mother's Jewish and you're born into a Jewish family, then you're a Jew. It doesn't matter what you do. You can be an atheist Jew. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe that, because clearly Torah says, I mean, even when you're talking about the 10 Commandments, the first thing is put no other God before me. The Shema, literally, the whole point is saying that God is one. We believe in him. It is a declaration of belief. And then funny enough is that in Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith, the first thing is that you have to believe that God is one, that he is our God, that he exists, that he is our creator. So while in the mainstream now it may be that, well, you can be an atheist Jew, the reality is the Torah doesn't say that. And then you do have many schools of thought that agree, that say, well, no, that's not the case. You know, some school of thoughts may say, oh, well, no, that's okay. They're still a Jew. They're just, off the road, off the derech, as they say, right? But the reality is that you can come back in, but you're not just off the side of the road. You went down a different road. That is the reality. And I think, in my opinion, a lot of that is rooted in bigotry and also fear of, well, we want to make sure that we're still saying this person's a Jew because we don't want our numbers to whittle as much. I think that there is a fear in that from some schools of thought that have carried over and that have made it this idea that you could be an atheist Jew. And then a lot of it also is bigotry, because Jews of color will have lots of barriers. They will go to a shul, they'll go to a congregation, and they'll be questioned about how are they a Jew, why are they a Jew, when did they convert? They'll be assumed to be a convert. Their intentions will be questioned. They'll be interrogated or made to feel uncomfortable. But someone else who appears to be white, at least in the United States as we understand race, appears to be white will get no questions. They could be an atheist and they'll still be regarded as a Jew. Isn't that interesting? A person who accepts Yehovah, who follows the Torah front and back, can be told by someone else, you are not a Jew because you didn't go through the conversion process that we've established ourselves, even if it's not in Tanakh. But this other person who doesn't believe in God at all, okay, literally doesn't believe in the covenant that even established Israel, oh no, we consider them a Jew. A person who doesn't even believe in the being that created Jews is called a Jew. There's a lot behind that. We can't close our eyes to that. I know some will disagree. They'll say, well, you can't do that. That's gatekeeping. It's really not gatekeeping. That's truth. Gatekeeping is saying, well, you're not Jewish enough because, you're still eating pork. That's gatekeeping. Because, yeah, the Tanakh says you're not supposed to eat pork. But the reality is, does that make you stop being a Jew because you did? No, it doesn't. But if you stop believing in Yehovah as God, that's the end of that. That is literally the thing that you have to do. You have to believe in him and only him and put no other gods before him. I mean, it's as simple as that. That's part of the covenant. That is the covenant. And when you do that, you're going to follow his laws and his statutes. It doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that you'll do everything perfect. But if you disregard everything and disregard him, how can you call yourselves that? Unless you want to voluntarily share it, no one has the right to your conversion story, or your story really at all when it comes to how you've come to follow God. Remember, this is about the relationship between you and him. It is you attaching yourselves to him. So don't feel like you have to justify anything. Don't feel like you have to give a reason that fits somebody else and what they feel is correct or in the manner that they feel is correct. Another thing, too, we really need to understand is that we cannot look at this with secular eyes. Because when we're talking about this is a spiritual covenant. So when we're talking about children of Abraham, children of Israel, you see in the verses in Isaiah, and you see even in the letter from Rambam, okay? that you become the descendants of these people. It doesn't matter whether or not you are a physical descendant through DNA and you can say, oh, I can track all the way back, whatever the case may be, or my family was always this way. It doesn't matter. None of that matters, okay? Because at the end of the day, it's about your relationship with God. Because when they're talking about the light of the world, it's because we are literally responsible for God's Torah. That's what it's about. When people talk about Jews as chosen people, you'll see a lot of things saying, well, are Jews really the chosen ones? Well, chosen doesn't mean better than everyone. Chosen means we literally have been chosen for this task, to protect and deliver his Torah. That's it. It's really pretty simple, you know? And we also need to get out of this idea, and I call it wearing the post-transatlantic slave trade lens, where you're viewing things in the parameters of race as established in the U.S. If you've listened to my past episode about not using the term Jews and blacks, etc., I described when race was created in the U.S., which is on record. Prior to the 1660s, there was no such thing as race. People did not describe anyone by race. You were described by your nationality. Okay? So it is something that is fake. It is a socio-political concept that has been used solely for subjugation. That is what it is. Okay? So let's get that out the door. Because race is something that is fake, but has very real consequences and very real effects, especially in the U.S., and unfortunately has now gone along, around the globe, right? And what I'm saying is we can't look at it within that lens, because we don't want to say, well, every Jew is Middle Eastern, even if they look white. Okay, no. First of all, you have converts. That's number one. Second of all, a mixed multitude came out of Egypt. That's number two. Number three is race has zero to do with nationality. As I said, it's a socio-political concept. If your skin looks a certain way and your features look a certain way in this country, they will lump you into one category. I think race is extremely destructive. As you can see, slavery, hello. But it's extremely destructive because it literally erases your cultural background. It erases your peoplehood. Because it's a very big difference to say that I am Igbo, which is a tribe in Nigeria. Not just African, not even just Nigerian, but to say I am Igbo. That's very different from saying I'm black. If a person says they're black, you don't know where they come from. You don't know what they practice. You don't know what they believe. Heck, you don't even know what part of the United States they came from, what foods they eat, what music they listen to. It doesn't tell you anything. But if a person is able to give you more information about their cultural background, you'll understand more of who they are or where they come from. So the purpose of race has been to destroy that, or try to destroy that. But I will say something, is that for people who cannot trace their roots to other places or whatnot, especially if you're a descendant of slaves in this country who were brought from African countries, you do have a culture. Because out of nothing, something was made. There was a culture beforehand that your ancestors had. Even if there were attempts to completely erase it, still, people made a way. Foods, music, dancing. There is a culture that you still have. And don't let anybody tell you that you don't. And just getting back to the idea that Jews are not one race. Jews are not one ethnicity. Jews are not one nationality. We are Jews. We are our own tribe. But we are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, mixed multitude of people. I mean, if we're going to be technical, then we can say, well, every single person on the globe is, comes from Africa. Essentially, because everyone knows that's where civilization started. Everyone knows that's where the first man was created. I mean, that's even non-biblical science will say that. So we have to really get out of saying those things. And I understand that argument of saying, well, every Jew is Middle Eastern. People will make that statement because of the political issues, where you will see white presenting Jews, typically Ashkenazi, who are told, well, you're not real Jews, and why are you in Israel, which is in the Middle East, and you don't belong here? And so their retort is, well, we do belong here because we're not really white, even though we may look white to you. And yes, they weren't always considered white in the US, but they are now. That's the reality, but that's why race is not real, because it's ever changing. It is not a permanent condition. Okay. And then you can come from a mixed race family, and you can have a great grandmother who is white, and you come out, as they say, black in America, or vice versa. It happens. It happens in many families. Okay. But yes, so I understand that there is that need to defend in that way, but you don't need to defend yourselves in a secular way, because the reality is, if you're talking about Israel, if you're talking about a political landscape, I'm not saying that you have to agree with the Israeli government or anything like that. But if we're talking just about the land and it being a Jewish homeland, right, then all you need to know is that when Joshua, son of Nun, crossed over and we were given that land by Yehovah, it was our land. That's it. That's all you need to keep repeating. Now, someone may not agree, and that's fine. But having to say that it's because of a genetic Middle Eastern ancestry, it's unnecessary, and it doesn't make sense, to be perfectly honest. Right? I mean, look at the fact that people call Egypt the Middle East when it's literally North Africa. How is Africa the Middle East? None of that makes sense. But that's a whole different topic for a whole different day. And again, too, we have to take off that, like I said, post-transatlantic slave trade lens that everybody wears because it was so pervasive, this idea of race, and we cannot apply it. We cannot apply it in any way, shape, or form to the Bible. It just does not work. That's not where it belongs, because it doesn't belong in society, period, anyways, right? So you can't say that, well, this tribe, and they have to look this way and that way. Tribes are made of multiple different people. People not only intermarried, but it's not like everybody looked the same. So you can't think that everything was homogeneous. That is a big problem. So a lot of this truly is changing your perspective, changing the way you see things, and opening your eyes up to view it in a very different way. So, like I said, hopefully this episode was inspiring for some, that it makes you feel more proud. It makes you feel better in your identity as an Israelite, as a Hebrew, as a Jew, that you can hold your head up high. And that if you've decided, or you realize, well, I follow the Torah, I've always followed it, or I started following it as an adult, whatever the case may be, you don't need another organization to say that you're a Jew in order for you to be a Jew. Now, mind you, I'm not talking about believing that somebody else is God as well, because we've made that very clear, okay? So I hate to break it to some who will say, well, I'm a Jew, but I still believe in the New Testament. No, that's not how that works, unless you're saying, well, I believe that, he was a prophet and there was nothing more than that, and he was telling us to get back to Torah. I can understand that. But if you're believing that somebody else is a deity, that somebody else is God in human form and things like that, that's not a part of this. That's really not a part of this at all. So I just want to make that clear, because that's not what I'm advocating for. And I think we also need to protect ourselves too, because when we're online engaging in discussions, you don't know who's on the other side of that computer. You don't know what their motive is. And some people will try to trip you up and things like that. That's why I say don't argue theology, especially not with strangers, and don't take theological advice from strangers. I'm literally giving you here Tanakh verses. Maybe you believe that way, maybe you don't. Maybe you read it and say, well, I believe it changed, or I still think I need this conversion certificate, or I still don't think that makes someone a Jew. You're entitled to your opinion. I'm just telling you what Tanakh says. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. I really appreciate the support. If you would like to get in touch or stay connected, please visit us on our Twitter or Instagram at A Jew Like Me. Also, if you're interested and would like to send a personal donation, because this is a labor of love, my Cash App is Torah Blessed, TorahBlessed. Thank you again so much for the support, guys, and I really look forward to chatting again next time.